Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
So my name's Peter Gabel, and I'm talking to you from the offices of Tikkun magazine, where I'm associate editor. I'm also a longtime law professor, having taught at the University of Minnesota, Berkeley, New College of California, Public Interest Law School in San Francisco. And I'm an organizer of the Project for Integrating Spirituality, Law, and Politics, a national organization of lawyers, law professors, and law students who are committed to connecting the longing for spiritual community, for empathy and understanding with law, but also with social activism. So it's trying to fuse the inner and the outer, you might say. That is our effort. And what we're specifically talking about is the effort to bring that perspective into the legal arena, into legal culture, where it is sorely needed and is strangely both present and absent. Maybe I'll start there, talking about it. So empathy is inherently present in law and legal culture because law has a necessary relationship to justice. Everyone, the need for the feeling of justice is present in all human relations. And when it is not present, people feel it as an inherent moral need, calling upon their spirit to do something to change the situation in order to make it more just, or at least to rationalize what is in terms of justice. And so in that sense, the legal system and legal culture is an arena in which empathic awareness is present, is inherently present. On the other hand, the legal system that we've inherited, that we currently inhabit, you might say, the legal culture that we inhabit, was born in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries and is associated with a model of human reality that is heavily individualistic and also materialistic. By the way, I'm sorry about the telephone. It'll ring sometimes here in the magazine's offices. So the key challenge for those of us committed to creating a world that fosters social connection, empathy, compassion, and understanding, a critical aspect of social justice struggles. A key challenge is that the model that we're working within, the legal culture that we're working within, perceives human beings in many different ways as socially separated and distinct, and as in a context where it is assumed that people may not tell the truth, may well lie, and therefore that we all must be maximally distrustful of each other. It's a paradox. The goal of bringing about an empathic world must influence the legal system at some point, because the legal system is the aspect of culture that defines what is binding on human beings. Something that's not just a matter of opinion, but that is actually the socially binding arena of our obligations to each other. So we have to find a way to bring into the existing legal system that socially connecting, transcendent impulse in a context where there's tremendous suspicion of the other and of really of all human beings toward each other. To fill this out a little bit and explain the elements of the legal system that reflect this individualistic, mistrustful dimension, first we have to start with the adversary system itself. That is, imagine the typical courtroom. If viewers don't have the experience of being in a courtroom, they've certainly seen the People's Court on television. They've seen courtroom dramas and the way that law is represented in popular culture. And the very process of law is represented in a way that people are at war with each other. They're trying to triumph over each other. There's a tremendous climate of anger and hostility and aggressiveness that is deeply imbricated in the legal process. And the very constitutional structure of trials and of the way rights are adjudicated in the society, assumes that everyone who takes the witness stand may not be telling the truth, that no hearsay is admitted, that you have to be able to confront all witnesses, that you can cross-examine them. And in a way, what you learn in law school, in the first year of law school, is you learn how to aggrandize your own position and make it seem absolutely correct, and minimize, demonize the other person's position, including trying to discredit them even if they're telling the truth. So the very structure of gladiator combat that characterizes the current legal profession is at odds with the aspiration to empathy and understanding. So if you see what I mean, the very legal process contains a contradiction and a living felt tension. The aspiration is to do justice, and that inherently brings in the spirit, the empathic longing of human beings toward each other. But there's so much mistrust built into the very structure of the legal process that longing is subordinated often to this gladiatorial struggle of one side against the other, with the judge kind of serving as an umpire. Now that's just the process part. Then if you actually learn the law, I think most viewers would have seen most viewers are aware of the Constitution as a great, historic, important document, which it absolutely was. It was critically important to vindicate the rights of the individual against the group at the time that the Constitution was written, at the time that contemporary American legal culture was being developed. And it was a great historic achievement to actually validate the individual's own autonomy and existence and rights as a separate being, and to protect the individual against the tyranny of group coercion and group control. If you think of the history of religious persecution, of the tremendous injustices that were done in the name of the community, the achievement of individual rights and the protection of the individual was a very great accomplishment. But the Constitution does not have anything in it about how we connect with each other, how we heal our alienation from each other, how we recognize each other and become fully present to each other in a just encounter of two beings toward each other. Its only focus is on protecting the individual from mistreatment by others and vindicating individual rights against the group and against other people. This is a core problem that I'm trying to address. Now, if you take from the Constitution, if you look at the other areas of law in American culture, contracts, torts. Contracts are deals that people make in the marketplace. Torts are people's obligations to each other that don't involve contracts, just civil obligations based on everyday social relationships. Corporations is another good example. The law of corporations imagines people as socially separated actors who may invest in a common venture, who seek to maximize their own short-term profits. That's presumed to be the goal of every individual in the corporation, and who hire managers whose obligation is to maximize the usually short-term profits of the shareholders. Well, if I start with the corporations model, there's nothing in the conception of the corporation that assumes that the investors or the managers, the leadership of the corporation, have empathic, socially conscious, or justice-oriented or compassionate objectives toward the society as a whole or toward the natural environment. The model itself is based on socially separated individuals seeking to maximize their own self-interest, measured in monetary terms and measured in terms of their separation from each other. The law of contracts is, when you study it, I taught it for 30 years myself. The law of contracts is the law of how individuals in the marketplace can get the benefit of their bargain in arm's length exchanges with other individuals assumed to be completely different from them and having opposing, usually, objectives in entering into a contract. There may be a cooperative aspect to contracts, but the basic structure, in the sense that in reality, In reality, all of the contracts together involve the cooperative activity of producing the goods and services of the society. But the way that contracts are assumed to function is that socially separated individuals are seeking to maximize their benefit vis-a-vis each other when they enter into these bargains. So the law of torts does not assume that we have obligations to each other beyond, we're obligated not to injure each other, we're not allowed to pull chairs out from each other when we're sitting down at the dining room table. If you pull a chair out from somebody when they're sitting down and they break their neck, you're obligated to them to pay them money for that injury. But in terms of rescuing people who are suffering, helping others, the entire law of torts doesn't address concern for the other, empathy for the other, compassion for the other's needs. That's not a part of our law. Do you see what I mean? What the problem is? It's that the entire
structure is geared towards competition and not for bringing people necessarily together.
No, in fact, exactly. And the same is true in criminal law, which people are very familiar with, is that the state brings charges against it. A crime is not perceived as a communal situation, that there's some tearing of the communal fabric, but instead, to protect the individual in a way, the state, in the form of the prosecutor, must bring very specific charges against someone who is then charged as a separate individual with having committed a crime against the state. The victim is not part of the process. The person who's been injured is not part of the process. It's just the state versus the defendant. The defendant is surrounded by a bundle of rights that protects the defendant from prosecutorial abuses. But what if the defendant actually committed some harm and wanted to say, I'm really sorry I did that, I apologize? There's an overwhelming assumption that no defendant would ever want to do that the defendant can deny everything, can never acknowledge responsibility, and is protected from having to testify, from having to produce any evidence against him or herself in most circumstances. Now, these things, of course, protect the person from abuse by the community. That was the great idea of our legal system, to make sure that those protections were there. But in terms of encouraging taking responsibility for wrongdoing, healing injuries, providing a context for apology and forgiveness, that's not present and is actually usually against the interest of the defendant. This is one reason why defense lawyers are so reluctant to participate in conversations like this, of saying, oh, well, okay, I want to stand up and be the moral representative of people who are accused of wrongdoing. But what I'm trying to say is they almost never have an incentive to admit responsibility because they're going to get a better deal in the way the criminal process works if they don't take responsibility and then plea bargain for lesser offenses, which most people are familiar with the way that process works. So, what I'm saying is that the key interest of our group is developing new forms of law, new forms of legal culture that can go beyond this, what I'm describing as traditionally called the liberal model. It emphasizes the liberty of the individual against mistreatment by the wider group and by other people. What we're trying to do in our project for integrating spirituality, law, and politics is to develop new forms of law that go beyond the liberal model. We want to acknowledge that was a great achievement, protecting individual rights. Now what we need to do is to create a new step in the development, in the progression of legal culture that connects people to each other, that fosters empathy, concern, mutual understanding, compassion for the other, and develops new processes, new ways of thinking, new ways of educating lawyers that leads them to learn how to bring about that kind of world.
So it's really, your whole process is kind of creating this empathic new foundation. Like, what are the ways that the structures, the
Right.
legal structures, that if there's been harm done to someone, how do you go about restoring connection between the person that feels they've been harmed and
Right.
perhaps did harm?
In our group, there are four main goals that we have in the PISLAP, we call it, the Project for Integrating Spirituality, Law, and Politics. One goal is the one you just spoke to, which is to support and try and extend the restorative justice movement. That's a movement within criminal law that seeks to replace the existing criminal process where the crime is understood as a bad act by a single individual to crime as a harm to the community as a whole, that seeks to gather the community together in dealing with accusations of wrongdoing and foster the taking of responsibility, if possible, acknowledgement of responsibility, apology, and in some cases forgiveness for wrongdoing committed, and reintegration of the person back into the community in a way that heals the entire process, including not only the injury to the victim who participates in a restorative justice circle, but also is a developmental process for the wrongdoer, and that may address larger problems in the larger context that lead to the commission of crimes and harms. For example, some people know Ronnie Earl, who was the district attorney of Austin, Texas, who's a member of our group, who for many years built up within Austin community courts to deal with small-scale crime that was being committed in the vicinity of Austin. And what those community courts did was seek to bring people accused of wrongdoing into a group process with citizens from the community, where there would be an opportunity to reintegrate the person who was committing a small-scale robbery of a convenience store or a theft from a convenience store, to try to focus on nonviolent offenses if possible, in a way that would actually help the person to grow instead of lead the person to participate in a manipulative, low-level court process that just returned them back into the street setting in the same condition they were in before they left, or sometimes worse. So Ronnie's an example of someone who's done remarkable things with restorative justice. A huge example of an attempt at restorative justice was South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There, as many watchers of this, people who tune into this website may know, after that revolution, when the black majority took leadership in South Africa, Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu inaugurated a process where white South Africans or anyone actually who had committed crimes during the apartheid era, were given an opportunity to come forward, acknowledge what they did, ideally apologize for it or take responsibility for it, and not be prosecuted for it. And so during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in order to prevent the bloodshed that normally accompanies a revolution of this kind, there was a constant viewing for a period of time of 22,000 offenses that were shown on television of people coming forward and acknowledging wrongs that they had committed in the course of the apartheid era. And it wasn't perfect. There were many, many flaws in it that we don't need to go into. But it was a tremendous step forward that did help that transformation of that society to occur with very little bloodshed. And it's the largest example I know of. It's the first major example on a worldwide stage of an attempt to bring the capacity for reconciliation into law in a way that was very significant.
I heard that New Zealand had their juvenile system has gone over to restorative justice. Are you familiar with that?
I'm aware of it. I've heard that and Brazil also, I believe, has included a restorative justice component in their constitution as well. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an example of one area of our group's emphasis that is trying to come up with a new criminal process, emphasizing going beyond the individualistic model to a model of knitting people together through public processes that foster social connection. Just so I list them, the other three key areas that we emphasize are the second area is transformative mediation or understanding-based mediation that seeks to challenge the process of adversarial combat that I talked about earlier and create in civil cases, not criminal cases, opportunities for mediation in which people can not simply have rules applied to their cases by detached parties after arguments take place in a public setting, but actually can seek to mediate their differences so that they can really come to understand one another and reach a higher level of connection with each other. The third key area, which is very important, is changing the way that people set up their private practices. Most people who become lawyers nowadays disappear into their law offices and are very cut off from the communities whose cases they see. They see individualized cases and apply their analytical rule manipulation abilities to those cases, but they don't participate in healing the communities and the relationships that led to the conflict in the first place. Some new forms of practice, including those by lawyers in our group, are trying to challenge that. There's one very striking one, the Georgia Justice Project in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a group of criminal lawyers who also have a landscaping firm connected to the law practice. Anybody who comes in there for representation, the lawyers enter into a contract with them where they agree to have a permanent connection to those people, essentially. If they end up going to prison, they will be visited by the attorneys the whole time that they're there. The attorneys do emphasize restorative justice where it's possible for the clients whom they see. And they require, as part of the representation, that people who are unemployed, who lack social skills, will agree to come work in the landscaping business that is part of the law firm. And they participate in a heart-based form of connection with their clients. And among the many wonderful things that the Georgia Justice Project does is they have, I believe it's monthly meals for all their clients, including their former clients, because they have a kitchen that's connected with their law office. And so the act of coming into contact with the justice system is also coming into contact with people who will be not only standing up for you from the standpoint of traditional legal arguments, but also connecting with you, having compassion for you and empathy for you as a human being, and seeking to help you put your life on a better course by virtue of the representation, and work with them. It's just a great project. And the fourth thing that we emphasize, the first being restorative justice, the second being transformative mediation, the third being developing new forms of law practice. The fourth is changing legal education. Most law students now who go to law school, each new generation, every year there's tens of thousands of them that enter into law schools to become the next generation of lawyers. And many of them, most of them, when they first come to law school, they come because they want to do justice and they want to make the world better. But if they come that way in September or August or September of their first year, by the time they reach November, they've lost touch with that. They've been reading these cases that are appellate cases that are completely abstract, involving laws of contracts, torts, property. They don't know what it has to do with their impulse toward justice, their impulse toward making the world better and caring about others. They're busy learning how to brief cases and make analytical arguments and do well in classroom settings that are intensely competitive and based on cleverness and fast-talking application of rules to facts, so-called. Well, that whole process, which is valorized in the existing society as legal reasoning. Whenever someone's appointed to the Supreme Court, there's always a big discussion of what a great legal mind the candidate supposedly has. The legal mind is actually a mind that is cut off from the heart, that is cut off from capacities for empathy, for compassion, for care, for love. Those aspects of our common humanity that are essential to human wisdom and that ought to be essential to being a high justice within the society. That's not what people mean by a legal mind. What they mean is cleverness, analytical ability to cleverly manipulate rules and facts so that they are either consistent with each other or different from each other. That's what you're taught in law school. And most law students have, by the time they get to November or December of their first year, they've traded in their heartfelt longing to make the world better without really knowing it's happened to them. They've traded it in for the social status of clever argument and a kind of detached, glazed eye way of being that we actually usually associate with lawyers. And one reason people don't like lawyers is that lawyers don't act like human beings. They act like, well, it seems to me that you could argue that he's not responsible because the piece of paper wasn't really worth anything. And do you know what I mean? I mean that robotic way of talking and acting that has the highest value in law school actually has a very low value when we think about what it takes for someone to be a loving, empathic, caring, concerned, and wise human being. So, transforming legal education to introduce the cooperative, caring, empathic component is another central objective of our group.
So it's kind of the first process is kind of like a circle process, which you see out in society as well for various kind of problem solving. The second process then is like a mediation
right.
kind of a process. And then
where two people, instead of trying to destroy each other in a legal process, try and understand each other.
Are mediated by someone that kind of helps that. The third process seems to be that lawyers are kind of like your empathy buddy, and you have this person that you have a personal connection
right.
with, and then the fourth.
It's not just, it is a personal connection, but it's also that when you enter into the legal system, it's not just the lawyer as your friend, but that when you enter into the legal system, your whole life can improve for the better by virtue of that encounter. So that law itself is perceived as an elevated opportunity for human development. That's the idea of the new lawyer that is empathic, understanding, and also engages, because the point is that when you see a lawyer, you're going from your own private world into public space. You're encountering the community as a whole. And here's someone who will stand with you in encountering that community in a way that is, the aspiration is for you to feel more whole, for you to improve where necessary, and for you otherwise to be treated justly and with respect and concern and care where that's what you deserve in a particular moral situation.
So it's almost like a spiritual guide.
Yes.
In a sense. It's like a friend and a spiritual guide that kind of assists you in your personal growth and connection with the...
That's certainly a key element. That's a key element of it, yes.
And then the fourth one is kind of teaching those processes.
Right.
For how to teach them.
Right, and it's not just teaching the things that we have talked about, but it's education. See, when a law student, here we are 250 years into this paradigm that I'm critiquing in this interview. When a law student comes into that, you can't put them in contracts, torts, property, civil procedure, constitutional law, and learning all those courses in a traditional way and then have a little empathy class on the side. That's insufficient. You have to figure out how, you have to train new teachers to figure out how to bring the cooperative, empathic impulse into those first-year courses and second-year courses so that they are taught in a different way. So that what's emphasized is both understanding existing law as it currently is and how to practice in that area in a way that can help to bring about the new society that we're talking about here. That's a challenge.
You're basically saying is that let's start this whole process with some empathy training. It's like learn how empathy works, how to connect with people, and then kind of build everything on that empathy.
Well, I mean, people do need empathy. We all need empathy training because we exist in an alienated world in which we have somewhat lost track of our connectedness to each other in a way that needs to be healed. That's why I'm an editor here of Tikkun magazine, which means to heal and repair the world. That same perspective needs to be brought into law school. But it's also, it's not only fostering your own capacity for empathy that's needed, but also being able to imagine how to connect that capacity with your work as a lawyer. So if you're in, for example, I'm a contracts teacher. In teaching contracts, the students in today's real world have to learn how the marketplace works, how people engage in exchange transactions in the market, and they have to learn the rules governing that. Those rules are reflective somewhat of the individualistic paradigm that we've been discussing, very significantly reflective of it. But what's taking place always also is a cooperative activity between people, in which people depend on each other, in which people need each other's support, in which it's possible, in other words, to perceive the facts of every case from the standpoint of people's aspiration to cooperate, rather than from the standpoint of their aspiration to maximize their own benefit and gain. Do you see what I mean?
It's seeing that people really want to cooperate and connect. It's like a basic...
And then finding how that is present in every case. Finding out how a lawyer can perceive that element, educating people as to how they can perceive that element in individual cases, and then encouraging them to figure out how they would seek to bring that out within their legal representation of clients. Well, that's a key thing to teach, because you have to both teach them the rules of separation and also help people see now how they can move forward from that state where people are protected in their own interests and their own individual rights. How can you move forward to figure out a remedy or fashion a remedy to this case that would foster a greater level of empathy, compassion, future connection between people, building together a cooperative society. The whole society is cooperative. It doesn't work unless everybody's working together to make things, to distribute them, to share them so that people don't starve and they have clothes to wear and they have housing to live in. This is a cooperative activity, but the cooperative element is usually not foregrounded. What's usually foregrounded, certainly in law school, is the self-interest element where the isolated person within his or her isolated family can make the most money. And that's what has to change. That's what this new generation of legal practitioners and law teachers have to bring into it to change the society.
And how's that effort? What's your kind of feeling for how the effort is progressing?
Well, my perception of the whole effort, including your effort to create a culture of empathy and to build a website and to bring more and more people into that, is that this is a gradual dawning or transformation of consciousness that takes a long time. It took a very long time, thousands of years, to get to the point where we were able to create a constitution that protected the individual, that validated the individual's own existence as being a critical and rightful mode of self-understanding, so that people weren't bound to the king, weren't bound to a hierarchical conception of religion, weren't bound to the chief, but actually existed in their own right as a source of moral truth. That was a great achievement. It took a very long time. Now we are in process trying to go beyond that to a new form of human connection that validates and validates in public, including in law, people's longing to be loved, to love others, to be seen for who they really are, and to be able to recognize the other for who the other really is as a person. That's going to take a long time. So you and I, in different ways, are just part of that great upward movement of humankind, evolutionary development of human beings.
So you've really focused on the legal aspect, and I've kind of stood back and said, well, what about empathy in the broadest sense in kind of every endeavor, and how do we create this culture that actually raises the value of empathy to be a cultural value? And so what do you feel are kind of ways that we can go about? You've mentioned building this culture of empathy. You've mentioned the legal process. Are there other ideas that you have for creating a culture of empathy?
Well, I'm going to stay with the law one,
Okay,
since that's
sure.
since that's really what I'm trying. The part of me that I'm trying to
Okay,
bring to this interview is to say, just imagine how powerful it would be if in the main square of every city, think of imagine every major American city and every small town. Right now, if you go to the heart of most towns, there are these buildings where the legal process takes place, where the courts are, where the city hall is. All of those. Imagine where the Hall of Justice and the criminal trials are. Imagine if in those highly public, important arenas in every major city, empathic efforts were taking place to bring about social healing. Imagine the O.J. Simpson trial, where the effort was to develop an understanding of how someone might have committed terrible crimes like this. Imagine, I don't know if that's a great example, but it's an example of, in contrast to the way that the trial was presented on television as a kind of fascination whodunit story of facts, imagine if social healing were at the centerpiece of what's taking place in most American cities. It would change the culture of life in the city. Everyone's attitude would be not, I am a isolated, withdrawn, separate person living my private life, disconnected from the public world, just trying to get by on my own and survive and watch TV and smoke dope or get drunk or whatever it is that characterizes so much of contemporary life. People would instead feel connected up to this aspirational moral enterprise of fostering human connection, and I think people would open up tremendously to it if we were able to build new forms of legal culture in the central squares of most American cities and through the media. So that's how law could contribute to this, how I think it will contribute to it over time as we build this movement. In other ways, I mean, the key part of social change, if your goal is to bring about a culture of empathy, is to help overcome the alienation in every sphere of life that separates self and other, that leads people to behave in an artificial and fake way, to play roles where they aren't really themselves, to exist in a media-saturated culture where people are encouraged to be inauthentic and fake rather than truthful in who they really are. And so our objective in Tikkun and in the network of spiritual progressives has been to foster a new form of social activism that doesn't only try to get more material benefits for people who are denied them. That's certainly one essential part of creating a just and empathic society, but also to transform human beings so that they experience, retain the capacity to love and more authentically recognize each other as human. That's how we can become present to each other. That's how we can overcome our present-day withdrawn state that characterizes the isolation, mutual isolation of so much of existence. That's our objective in putting out a magazine and organizing a political movement like the Network of Spiritual Progressives, and in trying to connect spirituality and politics. Empathy is a spiritual dimension of reality. It's invisible. It's not a material thing. It is a way of experiencing the other. And so we're trying to say that is as important to social change as any material change is changing our way of experiencing each other. That's the main objective that we have in organizing the network of spiritual progressives and in supporting a magazine and a community that emphasizes healing the world rather than simply changing it as if it were a thing and redistributing goods as being the only objective. The material objective is central. It's not to be minimized. But this other intersubjective, empathic, caring component is also an essential part of politics.
So it's like bringing in the caring and empathy as a theme within politics.
Yes.
I was just at the Democratic Convention, and I was talking with people about empathy, and then I went to the GOP state convention. I went and asked them about empathy. So I've been trying to engage the different participants in a discussion about empathy.
Well, and you can see with the nomination of Sonia Sotomayor to be Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court a year ago, you can see what a challenge it is to get people to really embrace this way of thinking. Because when you introduce our connection to each other as being a centerpiece of social action, of responsible social action, of what ought to be happening with corporations, what ought to be happening with the Supreme Court, what ought to be happening in politics in general, the Democratic Party, the political parties, what they ought to be emphasizing. When you bring that in, the fear that the isolated individual has of being manipulated and controlled by others comes right to the surface. So if you remember when Justice Sotomayor when President Obama nominated her because he was looking for a judge with empathy, and that set off a firestorm among the people who were afraid of empathy as a criteria. The idea of this conservative mindset that wants to stick to the individualist model of the 18th century and make that sort of the absolute requirement of the legal process and the social process in general. What's always argued is, well, I mean, empathy can mean absolutely anything. It can, and therefore people will be imposing their vision of an empathic, connected society on the individual in a coercive way. And we can never know what each other really means or needs privately, so therefore any real empathy isn't really possible. It's just there's your empathy and there's my empathy, but there is no objective empathy. I think that's the key. It's very, very important for us to overcome that fear, to realize that we are all human beings, we're all unique, but we're also all the same. We have the same longings, and we are the source of each other's completion. We can't do it without each other. So empathy is the essential element to true justice, is empathy and compassion and respecting the full humanity of the other as being the central goal of what justice is about. So people like Justice Scalia, who I've heard him speak many times, he's completely wants nothing to do with what he calls subjective factors influencing law. He just wants, we're all detached individuals and the only objective thing is the application of rules. The same kind of thing is true of Senator Sessions, who led the challenge to empathy on the part of the Republican Party in the Sotomayor hearings. That paranoid attitude, understandable if we look back at the injustices that have been committed in the name of religion in the past, in the name of spirituality in the past. It's understandable that that we make sure the individual is always protected from that kind of abuse, but we also have to bring back into it. We have to find a way to reconnect us to each other and to make that a key part of what all our social practices seek to accomplish.
Well, that one of the critiques that was said over and over again is it's empathy for one side and not empathy for the other. So there's a sense of fear that it will be a judgment for maybe the downtrodden against the wealthy, and
right. Well, but you see, that's a good example. There, in the world that I imagine, there wouldn't be downtrodden and wealthy, because we would create a sharing community in which our aim would be to treat us all the same and to maximize our capacity to care for one another as equals. Not to imagine that we are located in socially separate places, hoarding whatever we have against the risk in a scarce environment that the other's going to take it from us. And so the very model behind concern that there will be compassion for the downtrodden but not for the wealthy is that there are scarce resources that one side or the other has to get their hands on those resources, and an unfair advantage will be given to the the poor person, that's what the fearful images that you were referring to. That is essentially, at its core, is a paranoid, individualistic, fearful model of human relations. What we have to find a way to put forward is we can create a society in which there's enough for everybody, everybody can be cared for, no one has to go hungry. It doesn't rob you to care for another human being. It actually increases the meaning and depth and worth of your life to participate in that caring relationship.
Well, aren't they saying when they say that that there will be empathy for the other side, and not empathy for me? That aren't they sort of saying that there's a fear that the empathy, they will not receive empathy themselves? Yes. So there's actually a fear of not being empathized with.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, the attitude is it assumes legitimately, in a way, it assumes that if the group is given power to introduce this conception, this way of understanding into a potentially coercive processes like law, that the individual will lose out, will be harmed in some way by the use of empathy, whereas if there is no such thing, if it's excluded from the process to the maximum extent possible, then it's every man or woman for him or herself, and whatever you get for yourself, you can keep, kind of thing. And you know that it's going to be protected against anyone getting it from you. Well, the fears are legitimate. There are wrongs that are committed in the name of the community and in the name of empathy. Some people could be advantaged over others in that formulation. But there's also no moral direction besides seeking to get beyond that, to protect people against any abuses, but still to maximally encourage our capacity to care for one another. That's the only way to make the world better. It's the only way to get to a higher moral level as human beings from here. Otherwise, we can't get past the current socially separated world that we live in.
So it's a matter of if the conservative in that situation has a fear of not being empathized with, is actually speaking to that fear of your feeling you're not being empathized. You might not be empathized with. And so how can we work together to create the sense of empathy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that people, that conservative makes him or herself vulnerable in some way to his or her family, in some spheres of life. Some people never do. I mean, some people, out of fear that they will be abused by the other person, hold themselves back and remain withdrawn their entire lives. They build a little wall around themselves, emotional wall, financial wall, and exist in order not to be harmed and deal with that fear of the other. They exist in this isolated state. And absolutely, we social change activists need to move forward in a way that manifests respect, concern, and care, that doesn't dominantly manifest anger, bitterness, resentment, and rage, which has been a problem historically with the left that I identify with, is we got to get past the point of putting forward our demands in ways that increase the sense of fear of the other and decrease the sense of possible trust, possible voluntary participation in the social transformation effort. I mean, it's a paradox because it's true also that people don't change without militancy and pressure. So we have to become militant empathy advocates.
But what about, you didn't mention empathizing with them and their fears.
Sure.
You said care, but I didn't hear.
Well, I mean, I said that there are reasons to be afraid. You can be manipulated and abused by others, and you do if you make yourself vulnerable to a collective process. If you put yourself in a position where you are putting your hopes in a group instead, and in relationships among people, instead of sticking to yourself and in your isolated, walled-in state, you are more in danger of being hurt. And therefore, that does have to be respected. People do have to be treated with realizing that's a legitimate fear. We don't deny it, we don't ridicule it. And yet, you have to hope that, we have to hope that, the need, the longing in even the most walled-in person to get out, to be seen by the other, to be fully recognized, to redeem his or her innocence, and the longing for love that he or she was born with, the spontaneous pressure of that will, if in the right atmosphere, in the right social movement, in the right context, lead them to let down their guard. That's a political action strategy that involves compassion on our part. Yes, absolutely.
So we're in a situation now where you can kind of create a new system of kind of empathy, restorative justice, and these processes. But we also have this legal system where we have Supreme Court judges and Obama saying he wants someone that has empathy, and kind of this attack on empathy. It's like, how to deal with that existing structure, and how to kind of support the call for empathy within that structure even.
Well, I mean, you have that there again, it's a matter of activism has to be compassionate, it has to be militant, but compassionate and empathic. We have to proceed in a way where we manifest our own moral presence as activists, where we show that we actually do recognize the humanity of all of the others that we're relating to and interacting with. We're in a process coming out of hundreds of years of protecting the liberty of the socially separated individual. The whole paradigm is structured that way. The competition in the marketplace, the rights-based jurisprudence and law, where everybody's got their individual rights banging up against everyone else's individual rights. So yes, we're in a process in which we're trying to reconnect the heart and the mind, open the channels between each other, and build a politics and forms of activism that manifest that caring way of being in the world. The big thing we have going for us, against the fear built into the inherited structure, is that everybody wants it. It's a spontaneous, deeply felt, painful longing that exists within every single person, every moment of every day, everywhere. And so the great advantage of our side in this process, in this probably long process, is we're tapping into something that is present in the world, in every moment, in everyone. And if the fearful person felt it was possible to come out from hiding and participate in this socially connected world, he or she would. It's a matter of overcoming the terror of that it has to be part of our new activism. The new lawyer, the new legal activism, the new political activist, the new community activist. All of our social change efforts have to have that spiritually sensitive, not touchy-feely, not vague though, firm, militant, but compassionate dimension to it.
What does that mean, militant? Usually when I think of
it means you're not a wimp.
Mm-hmm.
It means you stand up and you insist that this is the right direction to go. It's militant in that sense. Militant, I mean militant because whenever you talk about spiritual needs, like what you and I are discussing now, people think, oh, well, this is just, psychobabble, people talking about the fantasies and wishes of their hearts. They're not talking about the real dimension of life. And spiritual people are thought of as being kind of gentle, to the point of not being ready and willing to engage in intense moral, what do I call it? Conflict, struggle, encounters with others. So strength has got to be a part of this. Confidence and determination has to be a part of it. It can't just be a nice, heartfelt impulse that we hope everyone will love each other. That's not it. It's militant in the sense of, no, No, we can move this way. We will move this way. I respect that you're hesitant about it, and some of your objections are good. Now on to the next point. Are we going to let's have universal health care? Let's all take care of one another and our families in the event of illness. We can do this. Let's foster a cooperative economy. Let's create a peaceful world, one that doesn't maintain security based on war. That's the wrong way to go. It doesn't work, and it's also cruel and harmful. That's what I mean by militant. You participate in demonstrations for that, but it doesn't mean you're disrespectful, hateful, rage-filled, sanctimonious. That's got to go.
Policy.
Policy and empathy. So giving up on the policy and the strategy and focusing on connection and empathy and letting that kind of lead to where the policy and strategy grow out of.
And so my response to that is that's a good idea up to a point, to not be rigidly committed to one set policy approach that you feel is the correct empathic or community-based approach. That if another person's resistant to that, maybe try to work in a bipartisan spirit, just if whatever will foster the process of cooperation and understanding is more important than the fixed outcome that one side or the other is seeking. Up to a point, that's fine, but if you take the example of illness that we're all subject to, the process of aging and getting sick and accidentally suffering diseases or suffering injuries, we all should care about each other, and we all should take care of each other when that happens to any of us or any of our children or our parents or our grandparents or our community. So I don't think you can compromise on that and still be committed to an empathic world, because it is basic to what we mean by empathy that we care for one another and act from a place of caring for one another. No one is expendable. Everyone suffers that equally, that suffering, and living a meaningful life is participating in that together and having the opportunity to take care of each other when we're sick. It's not just a burden, it's a wonderful, beautiful thing about life. So I assume you're not saying give up on that too.
I would say no, not at all. It's that we want a culture of empathy, and how we get to that culture is kind of left open. And if somebody is suffering like that, we're obviously not empathizing with them. So we have to keep working until whatever their needs are kind of incorporated into our worldview.
Right.
Into our policies, actually.
I think that's worth trying. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's right now we're living through the Obama era, where it may be that Obama has too much emphasis on the process and not enough emphasis on a firm commitment to the underlying empathic or communitarian values. So instead of standing up, he's trying to participate in some kind of cooperative process, and it's not working. It's not fostering empathy. What's needed instead is a stronger stand is what's needed to lead his supporters to stand behind him, to feel that we are fighting for a particular vision of the world. So it can't be mushy. It has to be strong and committed to a particular social vision of community and care. In terms of the exact details of any particular policy or proposal, I think there I agree with you.
Well, one thing I've been looking at is I've been dealing with some of the Johannes Messerly and Oscar Grant, the shooting, and I've attended demonstrations, and the demonstrations seem to revolve around peace and justice, and even those two sides are kind of at each other's throats a little bit, like which comes first. And then the whole call for justice tends to be towards retributive justice, even within that community. So kind of
retributive in the sense of
throw the book at Messerly.
At Messerly, the police officer.
Yeah. So one thing I've been kind of looking at is the whole relationship there of empathy and justice. How does empathy, which you've actually kind of.
No, I mean there is a perfect example where there ought to be a process that allows the police officer to really fully feel he can he can convey whatever the hell he thought he was doing in that situation. That incredible tragedy of shooting this African-American boy in the back as he's lying on the ground. I believe it was in the back. I mean, it was a horrible... It shouldn't be this completely separated world in which the sort of white identified pro-police people who perceive police officers as besieged, whatever the story is, the narrative is from that point of view, is at odds with the legitimately enraged, frustrated, and outraged African American community that sees a boy, a family that sees their son who's unarmed killed in this tragic and horrible way. Yes, there does need to be a process that seeks to maximize what understanding between the two sides there, has each story told from the standpoint of what really happened, no matter how bad what really happened was. What did people understand in that situation? What distortions came to bear on that situation? What way is there of healing the suffering that's been caused and the damage to the community and preventing future occurrences of the same thing? Yes, that would be a great thing, rather than only focusing on did he do it or didn't he do it, and did he think it was a stun gun or didn't he think it was a stun gun?
And how severe should the penalty be?
Well, that shouldn't be the main focus of it. What should be the main focus of it is what is a just response to a terrible thing that took place, that someone participated in. I don't know the answer to that. These things, unfortunately, in a world where these kinds of healing-oriented community interventions don't exist, that we haven't yet created them, then it's the symbolic realm that takes over. I mean, first, there is tremendous suffering that was caused by that killing. Secondly, there is police brutality in the black community. And there's injustice in the way the whole social structure is created, so that the African American community of Oakland is marginalized relative to more privileged communities, and there's much more material suffering and disrespect shown to that community in all kinds of ways. So the question is, how do we actually transcend that situation? The liberal model has not really helped us that much. It has done one thing, which is that it's fostered, owing to empathic social struggles, slavery was largely overcome and abolished. There have been improvements based on the liberal model, but in terms of processes that could foster greater empathy and understanding between two separated communities, we haven't been so good at that.
There's really a lot to talk with you about. I feel like I could talk for a couple hours.
I know, we should, and you have to talk to Michael.
But even going deeper into the whole justice and Obama, talking about that, there's a whole aspect of why is Obama not talking more about empathy? Why did he pull back?
Exactly.
There's the aspect of why haven't progressives supported him on empathy? It's like he talked about empathy, and the progressives have been fairly kind of quiet. There's been a little bit, but it's not like a big movement for empathy.
Well, this is a new discourse that you and I and Michael are trying. That are trying to bring forward into progressive consciousness. That thinking about the spiritual connection between us is key to what it is that we have to fight for.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.